Jamaica is undergoing a multi-billion-dollar transformation with new roads, ports, and buildings popping up everywhere. But have you ever stopped to wonder who's actually footing the bill for all this? The answer might surprise you, and it's not always the people you think. Before we dive deep into this story, if you're interested in uncovering the real forces shaping our world's economies, hit that subscribe button. We're on a mission to reach 5,000 subscribers, and your support helps us bring you more investigative content like this. Now, let's follow the money. Drive through Kingston today, and you'll witness something remarkable. Cranes pierce the skyline. Fresh asphalt ribbons through areas that, just years ago, were defined by potholes and neglect. Luxury hotels rise from coastal plots with breathtaking speed. The Southern Coastal Highway Improvement Project alone represents hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, promising to transform how goods and people move across the island. New convention centers, expanded ports, modernized airports. Jamaica is being rebuilt before our eyes. The scale is staggering. We're talking about billions with a B. Multi-billion-dollar projects that would strain the resources of nations far wealthier than this island of less than 3 million people. So here's the question that should be keeping economists, politicians, and everyday Jamaicans awake at night. Where is all this money actually coming from? The easy answer, the one you'll hear in press conferences and ribbon-cutting ceremonies, is that it's a combination of government investment, private sector enthusiasm, and international partnership. But that answer, while technically true, barely scratches the surface. Because when you start pulling on that thread, when you really examine who signs the checks and who profits from the signatures, you discover a financial web far more complex and consequential than most people realize. Let's start with the most visible player, the Jamaican government itself. On paper, the government allocates significant portions of its national budget toward infrastructure development. Tax revenues, both direct and indirect, flow into the national treasury. The government issues bonds, borrowing against future revenues to fund present-day construction. This is standard operating procedure for developing nations trying to modernize their infrastructure. But here's where it gets interesting. Jamaica's entire national budget for a given year hovers around $3 billion. Now consider that a single major highway project can cost upward of $300 million. A new resort development might represent $500 million in investment. A port expansion could run into the hundreds of millions. The math simply doesn't add up if you're only looking at government coffers. The Jamaican government isn't just stretching its budget. It's operating in a completely different financial universe than its traditional revenue sources would allow. This is where the international financial institutions enter the picture. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank. These multilateral institutions have been partnering with Jamaica for decades, providing loans, grants, and technical assistance for development projects. Their involvement isn't charity. These loans come with interest rates, repayment schedules, and most significantly, conditions. Policy reforms, structural adjustments, commitments to fiscal discipline and specific economic approaches. The World Bank, for instance, has active loans to Jamaica totaling well over $1 billion, funding everything from education reform to disaster risk management to, yes, infrastructure development. The IMF has provided multiple rounds of support, most recently through precautionary credit facilities designed to help Jamaica maintain macroeconomic stability. These aren't small sums. We're talking about financial commitments that will shape Jamaica's economic policy for generations. But even the traditional Western financial institutions don't complete the picture, because over the past 15 years, a new player has emerged on Jamaica's development landscape, and this player operates with a different playbook entirely. China has become one of Jamaica's most significant infrastructure partners. Chinese state-owned enterprises and Chinese government financing have fueled some of the island's most ambitious recent projects. The China Harbor Engineering Company has been particularly active, involved in major road construction projects across the island, and the financing mechanism, often loans from the Export-Import Bank of China, or China Exim Bank, a state-owned policy bank that specializes in facilitating Chinese economic statecraft abroad. Now, before we go further, let's be clear about what we're discussing here. We're not trafficking in conspiracy theories or geopolitical hysteria. We're looking at documented, publicly acknowledged financial arrangements. The Chinese government doesn't hide its infrastructure investments in Jamaica. In fact, it celebrates them as examples of South-South cooperation and mutually beneficial partnership. But the terms of these arrangements matter. Chinese infrastructure financing often operates through what's called a build-operate-transfer model, or variations thereof. A Chinese state-owned company builds the infrastructure, often using Chinese materials and labor. The financing comes from Chinese policy banks, and the repayment terms, well, those are where things get complicated. Some arrangements involve direct repayment from the Jamaican government. Others might include concession agreements, where the Chinese company operates the completed infrastructure for a period, collecting revenues before transferring full control to Jamaica. The scale of Chinese involvement is substantial enough that it's reshaped the entire conversation about infrastructure financing in the Caribbean. Some analysts praise it as a pragmatic alternative to Western institutions that have historically imposed stringent conditions and moved slowly. Others warn about the long-term implications of taking on significant debt to a major geopolitical power. The phrase debt trap diplomacy gets thrown around, referring to concerns that countries might accumulate unsustainable debt to China, potentially compromising their sovereignty or policy independence. Is Jamaica in a debt trap? The evidence is mixed and hotly debated. Jamaica's overall debt-to-GDP ratio has actually improved in recent years, declining from dangerously high levels through fiscal discipline and economic reforms. The government maintains that Chinese financing represents just one component of a diversified funding strategy, and that all agreements are commercially viable and in Jamaica's national interest. Critics point to examples from other countries, Sri Lanka's Hambantota port being the most famous case, where inability to service Chinese debt led to a 99-year lease to a Chinese company. The truth, as is often the case, likely sits somewhere in the nuanced middle. Jamaica isn't Sri Lanka. Its debt composition is different, its economic structure is different, and its geopolitical position is different. But the questions remain valid. When a small island nation takes on significant infrastructure debt to a major power, what are the long-term implications? What happens if revenues don't materialize as projected? What policy constraints might emerge? And China isn't the only emerging power with interests in Jamaica. Other nations, from the Middle East to Asia to Latin America, see opportunity in Jamaica's strategic location and its role as a Caribbean hub. Each investment, each development partnership, represents both opportunity and obligation. Now let's talk about private investment, because this is where the picture gets even more interesting. International hotel chains are pouring hundreds of millions into Jamaican resort developments. Real estate investment trusts are buying up coastal properties. Foreign corporations are establishing manufacturing facilities and logistics operations. This is private capital, not government loans, and on the surface, it seems like pure economic development. Foreign companies see profit potential, they invest, they create jobs, they pay taxes. Everyone wins, right? Not quite so simple. Private investment doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's often encouraged through tax incentives, through regulatory frameworks that favor foreign capital, through government infrastructure that makes private projects viable, that new highway that makes a resort accessible, publicly financed, the port expansion that makes logistics operations profitable, Government and multilateral development bank money. The tax breaks that make a manufacturing facility economically attractive. That's foregone government revenue, money that could have funded schools or hospitals or social programs. So even private investment carries a public cost, and the question of who benefits becomes crucial. International hotel chains repatriate profits to their home countries. Foreign real estate investors extract value from Jamaican land and send returns back to their shareholders in New York or Toronto or London. Yes, there are local jobs created. Yes, there's some tax revenue generated. But the bulk of the value, the real wealth creation, often flows out of Jamaica rather than circulating within the local economy. This brings us to perhaps the most important question in this entire investigation. What does all of this mean for the average Jamaican? The person working 2 jobs to make ends meet. The family struggling with the cost of living. The young person wondering if there's a future for them on the island. Who's really paying for Jamaica's billion-dollar transformation? Let's start with the most direct cost, debt service. Every loan, whether from the World Bank or China Exim Bank or private bondholders, has to be repaid with interest. Debt service, the annual cost of paying down this accumulated debt, consumes a significant portion of Jamaica's national budget. Money that goes to debt service is money that doesn't go to education, healthcare, social services, or other forms of investment in human capital. For the average Jamaican, this means living in a country that's simultaneously building impressive new infrastructure and struggling to adequately fund basic services. It's a strange paradox. Brand new highways but overcrowded hospitals, gleaming resorts but underfunded schools. The infrastructure is visible, impressive, photogenic. The opportunity cost is invisible but profound. Then there are the more direct costs. Taxes, obviously, but also the less visible ways that infrastructure financing gets passed on to citizens. Utility rate adjustments to fund improvements to the electrical grid or water systems. Fees and levies attached to various services. The slow accumulation of costs that make daily life incrementally more expensive. And there are social costs that don't appear on any balance sheet. Land acquisition for major projects sometimes means displacement. Communities that have existed for generations find themselves in the path of progress, compensated perhaps, but uprooted nonetheless. Environmental costs accumulate as coastal ecosystems get converted to resort properties, as quarries expand to supply construction materials, as traffic and pollution increase with development. These costs are real, but they're diffuse. They're hard to quantify. They don't make headlines the way a new highway opening does. But for the people bearing them, they're as tangible as any financial transaction. So who actually benefits from Jamaica's infrastructure boom? The contractors, certainly. Whether Chinese state-owned enterprises or local construction companies, there's money to be made in building. The financial institutions, absolutely. Loans generate interest. And whether it's the World Bank or a Chinese policy bank or private bondholders, someone is profiting from Jamaica's borrowing. Foreign investors benefit when their resort properties appreciate or their manufacturing operations generate returns. Certain segments of the Jamaican business elite benefit from contracts, from partnerships, from being well-positioned to capitalize on development. But what about the broader Jamaican population? This is where the trickle-down theory gets tested against reality. Infrastructure development does create jobs. Construction workers find employment. Service industries around new resorts expand. Better roads might make it easier for small businesses to operate. These aren't trivial benefits, but are these benefits proportional to the costs? Do they justify the debt burden, the environmental impact, the social disruption? And crucially, are these projects designed with long-term Jamaican prosperity in mind, or are they optimized for the interests of foreign capital and elite capture? Consider the typical major resort development. It might employ several hundred Jamaicans, which is significant, but the employment is often seasonal, relatively low wage, and concentrated in service positions. Management typically comes from abroad. Profits, as we discussed, get repatriated. The resort might purchase some supplies locally, but international chains have global supply networks and economies of scale that favor importing rather than sourcing locally. The development consumes coastal land that could potentially have been used for local businesses or community purposes. It may restrict beach access for residents, and it pays reduced taxes through incentive agreements designed to attract the investment in the first place. This isn't to say the resort provides zero benefit to Jamaica. It's to highlight that the benefit is limited, and the question of whether that limited benefit justifies the broader costs is both valid and urgent. The Southern Coastal Highway Improvement Project makes for an interesting case study. This is infrastructure that, in theory, benefits everyone. Better roads mean better transportation for goods and people, reduced travel times, improved safety, easier access to markets and services. Unlike a resort that serves primarily foreign tourists, a highway is public infrastructure with broad utility. But again, dig deeper. Who financed it? What were the terms? Will the improved highway primarily serve local transportation needs? Or is it designed to facilitate export-oriented industries and tourism flows? Does it open up new areas for Jamaican entrepreneurs? Or does it make it easier for foreign corporations to exploit Jamaican resources and labor? The highway itself is neutral. A ribbon of concrete and asphalt doesn't have agency or intention. But the decisions about where it goes, how it's financed, who it's designed to serve, those decisions very much determine who benefits and who pays. This is the fundamental tension in development economics. Infrastructure is necessary. No country can prosper without roads, ports, utilities, transportation networks. But infrastructure financing creates obligations and opportunities that ripple through society in complex ways. And when a small country with limited capital needs massive infrastructure investment, it necessarily becomes entangled with larger powers and larger interests. Jamaica isn't unique in facing this challenge. Small nations around the world navigate similar terrain, trying to develop their economies while maintaining sovereignty, trying to attract investment while ensuring that investment serves local interests, trying to build for the future while managing present-day constraints. It's a high-wire act, and the consequences of getting the balance wrong can echo for generations. There's also the question of alternatives. If Jamaica didn't pursue these infrastructure projects, what would be the cost of inaction? Crumbling roads and outdated ports impose their own economic drag. Businesses struggle when infrastructure is inadequate. People suffer when basic services are underdeveloped. So declining to take on infrastructure debt isn't cost-free either. It's a different kind of cost, perhaps less visible in the short term but potentially devastating in the long run. This is why the question of who pays for Jamaica's billions doesn't have a simple answer. In immediate financial terms, a complex network of lenders and investors provides the capital. The Jamaican government, through its citizens' future tax revenues, takes on the obligation to repay. Private investors put up money with expectations of returns. Multilateral institutions provide loans with policy conditions attached. Chinese state entities offer financing tied to Chinese companies and Chinese strategic interests. But in broader terms, who pays? The answer is layered. Jamaican taxpayers pay through debt service that constrains government budgets. Communities pay through displacement and environmental impact. Workers pay through the opportunity cost of development models that prioritize foreign capital over local enterprise. Future generations pay through the accumulated debt they inherit and the precedents established today. And who benefits? That too is layered. Some Jamaicans benefit significantly, particularly those positioned to capitalize on development opportunities. Foreign investors and institutions benefit financially. And arguably, in some ways, all Jamaicans benefit to the extent that improved infrastructure enables economic activity and improved quality of life. The distribution of benefits and costs, though, is far from equal. What makes this story particularly important is that it's not just about Jamaica. It's a template playing out across the developing world. Small and medium-sized nations trying to modernize, trying to compete in a globalized economy, trying to provide better lives for their citizens, all while navigating a financial landscape dominated by powers far larger than themselves. The specific details change from country to country, but the fundamental dynamics are strikingly similar. And those dynamics raise profound questions about sovereignty, about economic independence, about what development actually means. Is a country truly developing if the infrastructure being built primarily serves foreign interests? Is growth real if it's fueled by unsustainable debt? Are partnerships genuine when there's such asymmetry in power and resources? These aren't rhetorical questions with obvious answers. They're genuine dilemmas that economists, policymakers, and citizens grapple with. And they matter because the choices made today will shape Jamaica's trajectory for decades to come. There's also the geopolitical dimension that can't be ignored. Jamaica sits in the Caribbean, historically considered firmly within the United States' sphere of influence. Chinese infrastructure investment in Jamaica isn't just about roads and ports. It's about presence, about relationships, about long-term strategic positioning. The United States and its allies watch these developments with concern, seeing potential threats to regional stability and their own influence. Jamaica, meanwhile, is pragmatically working with whoever offers the best terms, trying to leverage great power competition for its own benefit. Is this savvy diplomacy or dangerous game playing? Again, perspectives differ sharply. What's clear is that Jamaica's infrastructure decisions carry weight far beyond the island's shores. Every Chinese-funded project becomes a data point in larger debates about global power shifts and development models. Every loan agreement gets analyzed not just for its economic terms, but for its geopolitical implications. For the average Jamaican, these grand strategic questions might seem distant from daily concerns about making a living and providing for family, but they're intimately connected. The sustainability of Jamaica's debt, the terms of its foreign partnerships, the beneficiaries of its development model, all of these abstract-sounding issues translate directly into quality of life, economic opportunity, and future prospects. So where does this leave us? Jamaica is transforming. That much is undeniable. Billions of dollars are reshaping the physical landscape of the island. The question isn't whether this transformation is happening. It's whether this transformation is happening on terms that truly serve Jamaican interests, both present and future. The answer to who really pays for Jamaica's billions is, ultimately, Jamaica itself pays. In debt obligations that will constrain budgets for years to come. In policy commitments made to secure financing, in land converted from local use to foreign profit, in environmental resources consumed, in sovereignty incrementally compromised through financial dependence, but also potentially in improved infrastructure that enables economic growth, in jobs created and businesses started, in connections to global markets and global capital, in the possibility, if managed well, of leveraging this moment into genuine, sustainable development. The question isn't whether Jamaica should pursue infrastructure development. It should, it must. The question is how, on what terms, serving whose interests, with what safeguards and what vision for the future. These are questions that every major project should force into the open, questions that every financial arrangement should be evaluated against. Because here's what we know for certain. The decisions being made right now, the loans being signed, the projects being approved, the partnerships being formed, these will echo through Jamaican society for generations. The infrastructure being built today will shape possibilities and constraints for decades. The debt being accumulated now will have to be serviced by people not yet born. The precedents being set will guide future decisions long after current political leaders have left office. Jamaica's billions have to come from somewhere. They have to be paid back by someone. They benefit certain parties more than others. Understanding these flows of money and power isn't cynicism. It's essential civic knowledge. It's the foundation for holding leaders accountable, for participating meaningfully in democratic processes, for making informed decisions about the country's direction. The story of Jamaica's infrastructure boom is still being written. The final chapter, the assessment of whether this was a wise investment in the future or a reckless accumulation of unsustainable obligations, remains to be determined. What we can say now is that the answer will depend not just on economic metrics, but on whether these billions ultimately serve to empower Jamaicans or to further entrench their dependence, whether they build genuine prosperity or just impressive facades, whether they represent investment in people or simply investment in concrete and steel. Who really pays for Jamaica's billions? Look around. Follow the money. Ask the hard questions. Because the answer is being written right now, with every project approved, every loan signed, every partnership formed. And that answer will determine what kind of Jamaica emerges from this unprecedented moment of transformation.